Thank you for bearing with one virtual presentation for the night. My name's Kayla MacDonald, and I have a lot to say and a short time to say it, so I will just jump right in. The topic of my thesis is bio-individual yoga sequencing. I specifically wanted to look at addressing mental health imbalances focused on just anxiety and depression using energetic balancing, these energetic qualities of Bṛṃhaṇa and Laṅghana, via obviously a yoga practice. So Swami Muktibarananda was commenting on the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and he says the main objective of Hatha Yoga is to create an absolute balance of these interacting activities and processes that go on in our body, mind, and energy. And I think this term balance gets associated with yoga all the time. If you know even just a little bit about yoga, you probably correlate that word with the practice. He goes on to say, if Hatha Yoga is not used for this purpose of balancing body, mind, and energy, then the true objective of the practice is lost. This is important, and I will circle back to this a few times. So notably here, yoga affects the physical and the subtle body. By subtle body, I maybe mean energy body. You could say this in all kinds of different ways. But just to highlight, it doesn't just affect this dense physical vessel that we live in. And it does so specifically. Yoga can affect the physical and subtle bodies specifically if we employ it with purpose and with knowledge. So it begs the question, and it's simple but important, what is balance and what does using this term imply? So the possibility of being able to balance physical and subtle bodies implies the possibility of yoga being able to create imbalance. So yoga can create balance for us. It can also create imbalance for us. I started studying yoga in 2016, started practicing in 2008. But in 2016, I went to Bali for my first yoga teacher training, and I started learning about this practice, specifically how and why it was working for me in my grief and depression after losing one of my younger brothers. And as soon as I got a peek behind the curtain, a lot of chips started falling into place. A lot of concepts and practices started becoming sort of automatically categorized in my mind. So there's this idea of being centered and being off-centered, and yoga as this toolbox to move from off-centered into balance. On this teacher training, I first heard of the terms Bṛṃhaṇa and Laṅghana under a category called the energetics of a practice. And I sort of started mentally compartmentalizing everything I was learning into one or the other. And then when I got out of my teacher training and I started putting what I had learned into action, working with private clients who primarily were coming to me with anxiety, depression, or both, and trying to use yoga to relieve their suffering with these mental health afflictions, those fell into categories too. So I had Bṛṃhaṇa and Laṅghana as sort of opposing categories. And then I had anxiety and depression as these opposing categories. And I watched yoga work for these people when I sort of applied this scale that was developing in my mind onto their bio-individual constitutions. So I sort of formally decided to call this, give the scale a name, use it with my clients, and decided to research and sort of pre-validate this scale during this thesis. So I've decided to call it the Bio-Individual Balancing Scale, or for short, the BIB scale. To take a closer look at this scale, and just to give you sort of an illustration of what I'm talking about, I thought this was maybe the best visual representation I could give for how I look at this scale in my mind. I think sometimes we can think in a very linear way, and where I could have just put a straight line with a center point and 2 points on either end. The fact is, yoga is not linear. We as human beings are not linear. Mental health and the journey with anxiety and depression is certainly not linear. So I thought this was maybe a better representation of how I think of this scale and how we move through it. We're constantly fluctuating, right? So the scale is basically made up of 3 points, opposing ends, and a center point in between. I've sort of simply labeled them as -1, 0, and +1. Again, this will come into play later, and this image will come back later to tie everything together. But this is just to give you a really zoomed in, simplified snapshot. And this is a little more of a zoomed out snapshot of how I sort of categorize and correlate these things on either end of the scale. So you've got, like I said, Laṅghana, which is sort of correlating with the -1 end of the scale. That could correlate with depression. It could correlate with the energetic quality of the practice of forward folds, of the exhale side of the breath, of a parasympathetic nervous response. So all of these things sort of go in this -1 category. And then on the flip side, correlated with Bṛṃhaṇa, which is on the +1 side of the category, we could correlate that side with anxiety. You can correlate that with the energetic practice of back bends, of the inhale side of the breath. So you can see how these are sort of in opposition of one another. And then what's not shown, but is certainly implied, is just sort of that line down the middle dividing them. That's our 0 point, the balance point, the center point, and it's its own category of things. But this is just to give you sort of a zoomed in, a little more complex snapshot of all these different practices, concepts, elements of yoga, Ayurveda, mental health that can sort of be organized in one category or the other. And I think it's important to highlight here pretty early in my presentation that -1 and +1 are just to demonstrate that they're on either side of 0. They don't correlate with good or bad. That positive and negative is not correlated with good or bad. There are positive pros and cons to both sides of the scale, pros and cons to being in the middle of the two. It really depends on your bio-individual constitution, where you're at, and where you're trying to get. So I just want to highlight this doesn't correlate with good or bad. It's just different points on a scale. I think the thing that's kept me so hooked into yoga is how grounded and science-based it can be. I think there are a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes related to yoga, especially as it keeps becoming more and more modernized and commercialized. At the end of the day, a lot of people think of yoga as maybe a woo-woo practice, maybe even spiritually or religiously based or rooted, and all of those things can certainly be true. However, I have been so fascinated and continuously enraptured by this practice because it's so rooted in science and facts and data. So a lot of what I'm talking about today really has to do with our nervous system. And I love this illustration. It says pranayama there at the top, but I wanted to use this illustration to just showcase, yes, there's a physical body with borders, the skin, the organs, the tangible parts of us. And we kind of forget sometimes, I think, that there's this whole energy subtle body that exists within and beyond this vessel, this structure too. And the nervous system encompasses, again, the physical and subtle bodies. Yoga affects the physical and subtle bodies. And this bib scale has the capacity, using the energetics of the practice, to affect and make change with this whole sort of fluctuating intertwining of all of these things that do affect one another. So I love this image. Just keep it in mind. I'm just highlighting again, physical and subtle body channels exist. I think it's important to sort of call out this sort of autonomic nervous system. Maybe you've heard of it before. It was originally sort of deemed this automatic system because we didn't believe that we had control of our nervous system responses. And in a lot of ways, if we let go of the reins, we do let go of that control. Maybe you've heard of the phrases fight or flight or rest and digest related to the nervous system. These correlate with a sympathetic nervous system response or a parasympathetic nervous system response, respectively. And for example, related to stress or anxiety, a +1 example, stress is stress. So when it comes to the nervous system, it's not discriminating between a lion approaching you and a text from your spouse that says, we need to talk. It's a stress, a response is created, and the body reacts. Yoga is this vast, expansive, deep toolbox of ways to affect our nervous system, to take hold of the reins and move ourselves in a specific direction. But if we don't know where we're trying to head or how to get there, you're just reaching blindly into a huge pool of tools, which can be helpful, but could be hurtful if you grab the wrong one. So the bib scale is really this tool I've developed and studied and now researched, that's sort of taking yoga and creating specific vehicles to take people in specific directions with purpose, depending on where they want to go. So to tie together everything thus far, just to kind of like zoom back in and give you this snapshot, I brought back the infinity symbol, the scale. So anxiety correlates with Bṛṃhaṇa, this energetic quality of Bṛṃhaṇa. correlates with a sympathetic nervous system response. All of that would sort of rest over in that +1 category, that +1 end of this scale. On the other side, depression, the energetic quality of Laṅghana, a parasympathetic nervous system response would all correlate with that -1 end of the scale. And then no diagnosed or perceived instance of anxiety, depression, or both would correlate with that 0 centered balance point. And then I put these sort of little colorful tick marks on the scale to really underscore and highlight the point that we're not necessarily on one end or between the two. We're sort of like leaning in a direction, and maybe we want to lean more in another direction. And I'll give a few examples of that. So Vini Yoga is this, there's a lot, like I said, yoga is this big, deep, vast toolbox. There are a lot of styles, a lot of lineages, a lot of teachers, a lot of methods. In sort of looking for which of them sort of inspire the bib scale philosophy and practices, Vini Yoga is the one that came up over and over again. Vini Yoga can be translated to mean correct adaptation of the tools of yoga. Again, this underlining of correct adaptation and use. These tools of yoga, they're tools. We can use them in specific ways to move in specific ways in specific directions. And Vini Yoga really highlights this sort of therapeutic application, which I think really ties nicely into what I've been trying to do with the bib scale. So bib scale philosophy and practices are definitely inspired by this sort of classical Vini Yoga approach, which Krishnamacharya and Desikachar were two sort of notable yogis who taught Vini Yoga, wrote about it, shared it. And it's really, again, about curating bio-individualized practices to reach specific goals. I take that in a mental health direction. So Desikachar has this quote that I think highlights, pulling out from mental health for just a second and applying this to other real world examples. Your yoga needs are going to be different if you're preparing to play tennis versus trying to stay alert, say in a thesis presentation, versus experiencing insomnia and trying to get ready to go to sleep and get to bed. There's a lot of yoga and a lot of different places yoga can take us energetically, a lot of ways that yoga can affect our nervous system, our physical and our subtle bodies. So Vini Yoga and the bib scale are methods of yoga trying to do so with purpose. You can apply this to anxiety and depression for sure. And this becomes so important because anxiety and depression are super common, increasingly so, as we've seen in statistics that show rates of depression and anxiety globally before, during, and now after this sort of ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. It's a huge problem. And what the bib scale does is turn this unpredictable, ever-changing, fluid game of life and the big, vast, expansive practice of yoga into a relatively simple mathematical equation that's accessible to all who choose to employ it. For example, if you're experiencing anxiety and you're on that +1 end of the scale, you want to get to 0, so you need to subtract 1. You're going to use -1 practices to move yourself toward that centered balance point. If you are on the other side feeling depressed, and again, this is all of the correlations too. Maybe it's not depression, maybe it's really fatigued. You're in that -1 category and you want to get to that balance center point, or even to energized, get a little pep in your step. You're going to add 1. So you want to do +1 practices. Yesterday, I flew in on a very early flight. I never booked myself for like 7 a.m. flights, but I had a very early flight to Nashville. I got in, I still had a whole day ahead of me and I was exhausted. I actually took my first yoga class ever here in Nashville when I was going to college at Belmont. And I was able to drop into this heated power vinyasa flow class at my old studio. And it was exactly what I needed because I was in a -1 bio-individual constitution. My state was fatigue. And I needed to do a whole day still. I needed a +1 practice to pull me up and out of that -1 space. Then you can see the example from the previous slide of if you're experiencing insomnia, you are in this +1, anxious, overly excited state. You need to pull yourself down. That class would not have been good for me. That would have just exacerbated my insomnia, my stress, my anxiety, and kept me from going to bed. So you can see that this is certainly an oversimplification. I'm oversimplifying yoga as an entire practice. I'm absolutely oversimplifying mental health as an overall experience, but it creates a foundation. It's foundational and it's usable. This is so important because as anxiety and depression continue to be these prevalent things that the global population largely is experiencing, we need usable tools to assess and address it. Right now, I'd say pharmaceutical interventions, prescription drugs, and talk therapy are two pretty common ways we're treating anxiety and depression. Those aren't always accessible to people, and there are stigmas attached. They don't fluctuate with us as fluctuating humans. And they don't avoid the harm that can happen in a person if their circumstances exacerbated. So this bib scale really addresses the issue of we're sending people to yoga to help with their anxiety or their depression, but we might be sending them blindly to the wrong class. It's actually going to exacerbate their symptoms and circumstances and make their anxiety or their depression that they're trying to relieve worse. So this highlights the use of a knowledgeable teacher being ideal, which brings me to problems with this whole concept and some propositions to maybe address some of those problems. Like I mentioned before, in yoga, there are a lot of misconceptions, a lot of stereotypes. And I think it's sort of up to us as the yoga scholars and yoga professionals to be pushing against those misconceptions and stereotypes. The whole concept of group classes versus individual instructions leads right into accessibility and equity as issues. Group classes have their pros and their cons. Individual instruction has its pros and its cons. But a bib scale approach, a therapeutic approach to using yoga to positively affect mental health afflictions in individual people isn't always possible in a group class because a teacher, even leading the most well-intentioned, well-sequenced class to 30 people, is reaching 30 different constitutions, 30 people with different bodies, different injuries, different goals of where they're trying to get with that yoga class. So individual instruction becomes this sort of ideal, perhaps, in this circumstance, but is it accessible? A group class is a bulk offering. It becomes more affordable because you're just paying for a slice of the room, a piece of the pie. Individual instruction ideally is being done by a more qualified, specialized yoga professional. And they've invested time and money into their education and experience and probably wish to be compensated accordingly. That access, accessibility, equity, bringing yoga for people experiencing mental health and trying to find relief from it using something like the bib scale brings up this question of how do we make that accessible to everyone? How do we create equitable access to such a luxury offering and item? And this brings up, of course, the issue of education and the creation of qualified yoga teachers. This has been a conversation we've had, a lot of this actually on this side has been a conversation we've had throughout this program within the MA. And also I took Dr. Judith Carlisle's Yoga Mindfulness and Social Change Certificate program. And we've had so many conversations about standardization, education, continuing education of yoga teachers, yoga professionals. We just have to continue pushing ourselves and each other to raise the bar and continue meeting that bar as it's rising in terms of being qualified to meet these clients, these students where they're at. You can almost guarantee that in a room full of people, majority of them are probably experiencing anxiety, depression, or both. So how are we affecting them? Because we are. And lastly, I think maybe an answer to losing some of the stigma, popping some of the misconception and stereotype bubbles around yoga is more funding and more research dedicated to things like Vini Yoga, to specifically something like the bib scale. I said pre-validating this scale because it would be great to get into some sort of clinical research and really validate it using population samples, EEG monitoring devices, et cetera. But to do so, we have to bridge this gap that sort of still seems to exist between yoga sciences, the science of Ayurveda, and so on, and sort of medical sciences, general sciences. So bridging that gap, creating more funding opportunities and research opportunities to show that this does work, show how it works, I think would probably lead to more people utilizing yoga as a tool for relief from suffering from their mental health. And as a global population who seems to be statistically suffering, I don't think that is such a bad idea. So I hope I did well on time. I just wanted to throw this in at the end. If you want to stay connected, reach out, talk about this work or further research. There's my website, socials, and email address, and I would love to stay connected. But I know I have a lot more to get to, so I will cut myself off here and pass the baton to the next presenter. Thank you, everyone.